Can you fail the driving test in Great Britain for going over an advisory speed limit? Well, the short answer is no. The advisory speed limit is not a legal requirement, and therefore, if you don't abide by that advice, that in itself is not a reason for a driving test fail. However, if the examiner felt that you were going too fast for the current road conditions, then yes, you could still fail the driving test. But what you probably weren't aware of is that you can fail the driving test for abiding by the advisory speed limit. Yes, this can happen, but more on that one later. So how can you tell the difference between an advisory speed limit and a compulsory speed limit? Well, advisory speed limits are in squares or rectangles. They can be digital with orange flashing lights. These are not a legal requirement. Compulsory speed limits, well, they are a circular sign with a red border. These are a legal requirement. If you were to exceed them, you are breaking the law. And there are even minimum speed limits. These are blue circular signs with a number in them. They're usually used in places like tunnels to try and prevent congestion and keep traffic flowing. Although those limits are often so low, I don't know who would be driving that slowly. Unless you're stuck in traffic, in which case, well, you have no choice. So what do you need to do to pass the driving test? Should you abide by the advisory speed limit or should you ignore it? Well, actually, it's neither. You should consider it. This is what I mean. To pass your driving test in Great Britain, you need to be able to drive safely and legally whilst making appropriate progress. You need to be able to judge how fast can I go on this bit of road whilst making good progress without causing problems for others, but not being so fast that I'm either illegal or unsafe. Advisory speed limits are there to try and grab your attention and say, hey, look, this bit of road is hazardous. You may want to consider driving at this speed to be safe. But the trouble is, road conditions change. That sign may not be appropriate for the current road conditions, or it may even be out of date. So it's up to you to be able to judge what an appropriate speed is for a piece of road. That in itself is its own video, but I have made one. I'll leave a link to it up there. Earlier I said it's possible to fail the driving test in Great Britain for abiding by an advisory speed limit sign. Here is an example of how that may happen. You're driving on a road that has recently been resurfaced, and after it was resurfaced it was covered in loose road chippings. The problem with those is it creates a semi-loose surface, meaning you have less traction. Also, you can flick them up, which can damage vehicles behind, but also it's not very nice for cyclists you're passing, nor the pedestrians. So what they do is they put a warning sign up for loose road chippings, and maybe they put an advisory speed limit up. Say it says max speed 20. But the speed limit for the road, the legal compulsory speed limit, is 50. And you're driving on it days after it was resurfaced. And most of those loose road chippings have now been embedded into the ground or swept to one side. Most of the traffic have returned to normal speeds for that road. You can see that sign saying max speed 20 and you're thinking, I'm on my driving test. It says max speed 20. I'm going to do 20 as my max. Here is where you could fail the driving test because the examiner is not using that advisory speed limit sign to judge whether or not you're driving at an appropriate speed. They're using the road conditions. So they may mark you down for following that advisory speed limit. If you're going a little bit slower than they feel is safe, then they may give you a minor mark. But if you're going grossly slower than they feel is safe, seriously slower, then they may give you a serious mark and therefore you fail. You're more likely to get a serious mark if you're causing queues of cars behind you and people to be overtaking you. A way to judge whether or not the advisory speed limit for a recently resurfaced road is still applicable is to listen. When you drive on the road, can you hear those loose road chippings being flicked up in the arches of the car making a racket? Does the road look clean? If you can't hear them and it looks clean, then it's most likely safe to return to normal speed. Another way you could fail the driving test for abiding by an advisory speed limit is in a school area. The sign says school zone, and in a rectangle it says max speed 20 when lights flash. but it's a bank holiday or a school holiday and the pavements are empty and you're driving at 20 miles per hour, causing a big queue behind you and encouraging people to overtake you. This in itself could lead to a serious mark on the driving test and therefore a driving test fail. But it doesn't have to be a serious mark for you to fail, because a lot of people forget that you can actually fail the driving test for just 2 driving faults, 2 minor driving faults, but one minor was almost as serious, and then you do it again almost as serious, and then those 2 almost serious faults actually become a serious fault. On the DL25 driving test report, there are 3 kinds of driving fault an examiner can mark. The driving fault, which many people call the minor fault. I say minor fault because that's what most people understand, and I see it as my job to be understood, not to dictate official terminology, which is simply driving fault. You get the serious fault, which is a driving test fail, and a dangerous fault, which is also a driving test fail. Question is, how many minors can you get and still pass? Well, in theory, you can get 15 minors and still pass. 16 is a fail, but that's in theory. In reality, if you've got anywhere near 15 minors, you've probably failed the driving test for something during that test. Most people who pass have less than 10 minors. But what you need to understand is that that's 15 minors throughout the whole of that DL25 report form. Signalling, use of mirrors, speed, all kinds of boxes they can tick. They only allow so many minors in one specific category. There is a myth that 3 minors in one category becomes a serious, but that's not true. I've actually seen many more than 3 and still have a driving test pass. Let's take appropriate speed. Appropriate speed essentially means too slow. They have use of speed, they tick that when you're going too fast, and appropriate speed when you're going too slow. And let's say you're driving and you're driving a bit slow, and the examiner thinks you're going slow enough that I should mark that as a minor fault for appropriate speed, but you're only just slow enough. It's only just worth marking, but it is worth marking. But as it's only just a minor, it's not anywhere near serious, they'll let that go many times, that same kind of fault many times before it becomes a serious. But let's say you weren't a little bit too slow, you were really too slow, and now the examiner is thinking something else. They're thinking, well, I want to see more. I don't want to fail you just yet, but if you drive that slowly, that's going to have to be a fail if you continue to do that. And you go and do a couple of junctions, and you do another stretch of road, and you drive that slowly again. Well, that's how 2 minor marks can actually become a serious, and that's how you can fail the driving test for just 2 minors. On dual carriageways and motorways, you may actually cause more danger by following the advisory speed limit. Advisory speed limits on these roads would usually be a digital board with the number and some orange flashing lights. No red circle if it's advisory. Let's say it's a 40 mile per hour advisory limit and the speed limit for the road is 70 miles an hour for cars, and you slow down to 40, and then as a result you see traffic from behind catching up quick, having to slam on the brakes and changing lane behind you to pass you at the last moment. Doing 40 in that situation is probably causing more danger than sticking with the flow of traffic. So in that situation, it's most likely better to stick with the flow of traffic, keep a good gap between you and the vehicle in front, and look out for brake lights to try and figure out why it's an advisory limit of 40. What's going on? Is there going to be a queue up ahead? Of course, if it's a compulsory limit, so that'll be a speed limit with a red border, then you must abide by that limit or you would be breaking the law. Advisory speed limits for bends are usually good advice because often they're on high speed roads and they're for bends that are sharper than they actually look. And if you slow down to that advisory speed, that's going to give you more time to assess how sharp the bend is, what are the road conditions like, and how far you can see. What you don't want to do is get to the bend and have to brake unexpectedly hard mid-bend, because that means you're more likely going to understeer, therefore you may lose your position in the road and you may even leave the road entirely if you really are going too fast. You don't have to do the advisory speed limit around the bend, but it's a good starting point if you don't know the road. When it comes to driving on higher speed roads though, it's better to do the braking before the steering, and that's because tyres aren't very good at multitasking. If you try to brake and steer around the bend at the same time, your tyres are both trying to slow you down and steer you around that bend. They're trying to do two jobs at once. But if you brake before the bend and then steer around the bend, your tyres are only slowing you down as you approach the bend, and they're only steering you around the bend as you go around the bend. So your tyres have one task to do at a time, meaning they have more capability at each task, and therefore you're less likely to skid on the bend. In my experience though, driving examiners are usually much more lenient if you're going too slow and there is an advisory speed limit sign telling you to go too slow, because they understand the reason why you're going too slow may not be because of your judgment. It may be because there's a sign there saying max speed 20, you're on your driving test and you don't want to go against the sign on your driving test. However, they are only so lenient. That sign is not compulsory, and if your speed is grossly too slow for the conditions, and or you're holding people up, and or your low speed is creating danger, then you may fail the driving test. Having said all that I have said about advisory speed limits, the fact that you can actually fail your driving test for abiding by it, and the fact it's not the law, it's advice, you can actually get into trouble for driving faster than the advisory speed. Let's say something bad happens, you get into a collision, and it can be proven that you're going faster than the advisory speed, and that going faster than the advisory speed contributed to the collision, then that can be held against you. That can be one of the factors that determines whether or not you get punished and how you get punished. Advisory speed limits are there to give you a heads up, to advise a speed you should consider, but ultimately it's up to you to decide what speed is appropriate for the current conditions and that is safe and within the legal limit. If you found the video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you're looking for car insurance, check out the links to Collingwood and Confused in the description. If you're learning to drive and want to insure yourself on somebody else's car, then Collingwood are there for you, because you can do so without affecting the owner's policy, and that takes away a big stress from the owner of that car that you're using to practice your driving in. Via the link at the moment, there's up to 35% off and a £20 Amazon gift card. If you want to insure your own car, I recommend checking out the link to confused.com, because you fill out one quote form and get loads of quotes back from many insurers to compare who's cheapest, and you can change your car on that quote as many times as you like without having to do the whole quote again. It's quick and easy, just change the car and recalculate. So it's an easy way to compare how much it costs to insure different cars. Using the links doesn't cost you anything, but it does support the channel, so thank you very much. Subscribe to get my future videos, and until the next one, cheerio.